Who are the greatest players of the last 10 years in the NFL? In this video, I'm going to give you my all-decade team for the 2010s. Honestly, I don't know many people that have watched more football over the last 10 years in the NFL. So in this video, I'm going to provide you with my all-decade team from 2010 to now, 2019. My criteria for this list, it's pretty simple. I'm looking at numbers, statistics, winning, dominance, and the impact of the player and how much of an impact that player had on this decade of football. I'll be picking the offense, the defense, the special teams, and the head coach for the all-decade team of the 2010s. But before I give you my all-decade team of the 2010s, make sure that you do spike the like button, subscribe to the Bottom Line View for more NFL content just like this, and comment below your team. I want to hear from you. Who's on your all-decade team of the 2010s? And let me know if you love my team or maybe you hate my team. Let me know who I left off the list that should be on the team, and let me know who I got just right. Let's start off the team at the quarterback position, and this is one of the more obvious positions. It's Tom Brady. Despite the greatness that we've seen at the quarterback position for this entire decade from a lot of different guys, whether it's been Russell Wilson or Ben Roethlisberger, even guys like Matt Ryan and Cam Newton winning MVPs, of course Aaron Rodgers and Drew Brees were in the conversation, but it is Tom Brady, who is the all-decade quarterback of the 2010s. He's a three-time Super Bowl champion of this decade, appearing in 5 Super Bowls throughout the decade, 3-time All-Pro, and a 2-time Super Bowl MVP. He won the Offensive Player of the Year in 2010. The same year, he was named the first unanimous MVP in NFL history. He threw 314 touchdowns and only 79 interceptions throughout this decade, the second most touchdowns throughout the decade, the fourth most passing yards, and of course, first in wins with a staggering 121-33 record, a 16-6 playoff record, 2-time touchdown leader, a yards leader, and of course, a Madden cover. Tom Brady is the GOAT. And this is really the decade where he became the GOAT. In the 2000s, he ended that decade as a Hall of Fame quarterback. But once he got to 2010, and now at the end of the decade, he is now considered the greatest of all time. And it's because of his work and longevity throughout this decade. At the running back position, I have selected Adrian Peterson. Peterson is my pick for his pure dominance at the position. Really, I didn't see a running back that took over games, was able to carry teams the same way that Adrian Peterson did throughout this decade. Of course, in 2012, it was one of the greatest running back performances we've ever seen from the running back position. He was the MVP. He was the Offensive Player of the Year. He had a 2,000-yard rushing season, and he was only a few yards shy of breaking Eric Dickerson's long-lasting rushing yards record in a season. Adrian Peterson is a beast. He's still playing today, and he's still a pretty good back in the NFL. AP had the strength, the power, the speed, and the determination to be one of the greatest running backs of all time. He had 5 1,000-yard seasons throughout this decade. He's a 4-time Pro Bowler, a 4-time All-Pro. He led the league in rushing twice, and he was a 1-time rushing touchdown leader. AP is without a doubt, in my opinion, the running back of the decade. At the fullback position, I picked Kyle Juszczyk. Personally, I would say this is the weakest position of all the positions of this decade. As we saw at near the mid to late 2000s, the fullback position was kind of gone in the NFL, but it has had a resurgence as of late, especially the last 5 years, with some of the greatest, best offensive coaches in the game like Josh McDaniels, Kyle Shanahan, and Sean Payton heavily utilizing the fullback position. Kyle Juszczyk is the fullback of the decade, and really to me, Juszczyk is the definition of what a fullback has become in the NFL. He can both block, he can run with the football, and he can catch the football. He's also the highest paid fullback, I believe, of all time, with what Kyle Shanahan and John Lynch paid him in San Francisco. He's well worth the money, and he finds his place on the 2010s All-Decade team. At the wide receiver position, one of the most loaded positions and the one, I would say, with the most depth. The wide receiver position is extremely impressive from this decade, and it starts off with my number one pick, Antonio Brown. Yes, Antonio Brown has a little bit of an off-field issue right now, and he's a little bit of a nutcase for some people, but Antonio Brown, when it comes to playing on the football field, there are not many receivers I can say have ever been better. And to me, what he did throughout this decade was one of the most dominant runs I've ever seen from a receiver, and one of the most dominant runs of all time. Antonio Brown was a 5-time All-Pro from 2013 to 2017. All of those seasons in a row. 7-time Pro Bowler, a 2-time receiving yard leader, a 1-time touchdown leader, and a 2-time receptions leader. He had 7 straight 1,000-yard seasons, 6 100-catch seasons, and he had the most catches through a 7-year period. Antonio Brown finished the decade with the second most catches, yards, and touchdowns. AB is an incredible route runner, an incredible change of speed that threw off his cornerbacks. He was also a great returner. He had this ability to Tony toe tap on the sidelines and catch the deep ball like nobody's business from Ben Roethlisberger. Antonio Brown was a complete receiver, a dynamic playmaker, and the best receiver, in my opinion, of the decade. Now, running up Antonio Brown, the number 2 receiver of the decade, in my opinion, is Julio Jones. Julio Jones was a 4-time All-Pro, likely to be 5 this season, 7-time Pro Bowler, a 2-time yards leader, and a 1-time reception leader. If there was a guy that was contending with AB throughout AB's prime, it was definitely Julio. A lot of people would even say they prefer a Julio Jones over an Antonio Brown because he is physically more dominant with his combination of leaping ability, speed, and strength. Not to mention, Julio is also a very quiet player and a good team guy, which I think a lot of fans also really like. 7 1,000-yard seasons, 6 in a row, and he's continuing his legacy going into the next decade as one of the best receivers in the game. Led the NFL in yards per game 3 times, and he had the most yards in the entire decade. He also was on a Super Bowl appearing team in 2016 with the Matt Ryan Atlanta Falcons, one of the greatest offenses we've ever seen. So Julio Jones had his team success, he had the individual success, and he's continuing to do it even today. Julio has dominated this decade and hopes to expand his Hall of Fame resume in 2020. The third receiver and the last receiver on the All-Pro team, there was a lot of guys I could have put in this spot. I could have put Larry Fitzgerald. I could have put Demaryius Thomas. I could have put Calvin Johnson, who didn't make my list. I could have put D-Hop. Or maybe I could have even put Dez Bryant. A lot of people sleep on him. I am going with A.J. Green. The reason why I'm going with A.J. Green is I feel like A.J. Green had the balance of longevity in this decade, but also dominance. While I feel like a guy like Larry Fitzgerald was more about longevity, while he was good for most of the seasons, I don't think we considered Larry in this decade a top 5 receiver for many seasons. While A.J. Green, every year he has been healthy, he's been a top 5 receiver in the game. A.J. Green in this decade, a 2-time All-Pro, a 7-time Pro Bowler. He has had 6 1,000-yard seasons with 5 straight. When he's healthy, he basically catches 1,000 yards. That's just A.J. Green. And he did this on the Bengals. I got to give him props for that. With an average quarterback in Andy Dalton. 5th in yards, 7th in touchdowns, 10th in receptions, all top 10 in all those categories for A.J. Green. He finishes the decade, A little bit like, what's the future going to be for AJ Green? Is he going to continue his legacy, or are these injuries going to be too much? But regardless, I have him on my all-decade team of the 2010s. At the tight end position, regardless of all of the incredible tight ends that were throughout this decade, whether it was Travis Kelce or Zach Ertz or a George Kittle today, a Jason Witten, we had kind of a mix of a new guard and an old guard kind of intertwining within the 2010s. But the guy that stands out above the rest is, of course, Rob Gronkowski, who, in my opinion, is the greatest tight end ever to step foot on a football field. 3-time Super Bowl champion with 5 appearances with the New England Patriots, and a huge part of it. 4-time All-Pro, 5-time Pro Bowler, first in yards per game, first in touchdowns, and first in yards per reception for the tight end position. This is how good Gronk was. He was also 11th in yards per reception in the entire decade. So that includes guys that ran 4.2s like Deshaun Jackson. That included deep threats like Vincent Jackson and Odell and Julio and all of these type of guys. And you have a tight end who's 11th in yards per reception, Rob Gronkowski. He was a touchdown leader in 2011, the first tight end ever to do so, and I believe the only tight end ever to do so even today. Gronk broke multiple records throughout his career. The only thing that he didn't have consistently was the health. He did finish the decade with the most touchdowns of any player as a receiver. So, Gronk, you did something good. He is my tight end of the 2010s. Let's go to the offensive line. The big boys, let's start off with the tackle position. I feel like this is the best offensive lineman of the 2010s. That's Joe Thomas of the Cleveland Browns. Joe Thomas is now retired, and he looks to go into the Hall of Fame very, very quickly. He is a 7-time Pro Bowler, a 7-time All-Pro. Joe Thomas missed like barely any games throughout the course of his career. He was an absolute warrior, and he played on the worst team of the decade, but he was by far their best player, and you could only imagine if he was on a better team how great his legacy possibly would have been if he would have added like a Super Bowl or something like that. But regardless, Joe Thomas was a force and a guy that I think is heavily overlooked for the dominance that he held at his position. The other tackle is Tyron Smith of the Dallas Cowboys. Smith is also an excellent football player, spanning the decade as one of the most dominant forces on the offensive line. 7-time Pro Bowler, a 4-time All-Pro, a big part of DeMarco Murray, Ezekiel Elliott's success on the ground, and Dak Prescott and Tony Romo's success through the air. Tyron Smith is the second best tackle of the decade and would be on the opposite side of Joe Thomas. At the guard position, a position that I feel like is not as strong as the tackle position or as looked at and analyzed as a tackle position, but still some very good players at this position. Let's start off with MARSHAL YANDA, who's my number 1 guard of the decade of the Baltimore Ravens. He's a Super Bowl champion, a 6-time All-Pro. He is a 8-time Pro Bowler, likely to be 7-time All-Pro this season. MARSHAL YANDA is just such a great all-around guard, especially when it comes to the run game, pulling in the run game. He is incredibly intelligent for the guard position. Of course, he won a Super Bowl in 2012, being a main part of a team that was mostly the ground attack. And today, again, with Lamar Jackson in a different style of ground attack. He's just been able to span the decade as a dominant guard. He's been able to play in multiple different kind of systems and be able to play guard for the Ravens and be a leader for the Ravens. And even with some of his injuries, has been able to come back and be dominant. So MARSHAL YANDA is one of the guards on the team. The opposite side is another Dallas Cowboy on the offensive line. That is Zach Martin. I would not have said that an offensive lineman would make the all-pro team of the 2010s, the all-decade team of the 2010s, if he only was drafted in like 2014. But that's the case with Zach Martin because he has made an all-pro team every single year he has played. He has been a Pro Bowler every single year he has played. That's 6 Pro Bowls. That's 5 all-pro teams, likely to be a 6th. Zach Martin is just a force at the guard position, and I would say he's been consistently the best guard since he's been drafted in the NFL. And at the center position, This was a difficult one because nobody really stood out. I feel like there are some guys that you could put on this team that maybe aren't this choice. So let me know in the comments. But I have Alex Mack. I feel like Alex Mack, for what he was able to give to both the Browns and Atlanta, was worthy of this team. Of course, he was a part of that 2016 dominant offense. He was also a part of a very underrated offensive line in Cleveland with Joe Thomas. Alex Mack, a 6-time Pro Bowler, a 3-time All-Pro, and of course his Super Bowl appearance in 2016. He, to me, had the most consistent all-around best decade at the center position. Now, flipping to the opposite side of the ball, let's start off with the defensive tackles on defense. And you can't go without the all-decade team of the 2010s without saying Aaron Donald. Aaron Donald is a 2-time Defensive Player of the Year, Defensive Rookie of the Year in 2014, a sack leader in 2018, likely to be a 5-time All-Pro, which I believe is almost every season he's played, maybe despite his rookie season, a 6-time Pro Bowler. He finished 18th in sacks, 2nd for defensive tackles, 5th in tackles for loss, and 10th in quarterback hits. Now, all of that is despite being drafted. Like I said, he was Rookie of the Year in 2014. So he's done all of this in 6-ish seasons in the NFL, only really half of a decade. So Aaron Donald has dominated since entering the league and is arguably the best defensive player of the decade, and I'm going to say is going to go on to the next decade being maybe the best defensive player in that decade as well. So Aaron Donald is the first defensive tackle. As for the second defensive tackle, it was a lot more interesting to debate and to place this person on my list. I have Geno Atkins as the second defensive tackle on the team. Now, I contemplated Ndamukong Suh the hardest versus Geno Atkins, but I went with Geno Atkins because the type of defensive tackle that has dominated the NFL the most has been the pass rushing interior force, like Aaron Donald. And Geno Atkins was kind of that first type of guy in this decade to start to dominate. Geno Atkins is a 7-time Pro Bowler within this decade. He's a 3-time All-Pro. He finished 15th in sacks, which is first for defensive tackles, 14th in tackles for loss, 3rd for defensive tackles, and he is 11th in quarterback hits. That's also 3rd for defensive tackles. Atkins was just mostly a pass rushing force. And you have to remember that the Bengals had a lot of really good teams at the beginning of this decade. Atkins was a huge reason for that on the defensive side of the ball, so I did give him the slight edge over Suh. At the defensive end position, it's the best defensive player of this decade, in my opinion. I know I spoke highly of Aaron Donald, but even Aaron Donald wasn't as dominant as J.J. Watt throughout the 2010s. The best defensive player of the decade, bar none. No chance for anybody else. I mean, not many people have won 3 Defensive Player of the Year awards. 2012, 2014, 2015. J.J. Watt was arguably the best player in football in every single one of those seasons. He was a 5-time first-team All-Pro throughout the decade, a 5-time Pro Bowler as well, a 2-time sack leader, a guy that had 2 20-sack seasons, which not many people can say. He also had 4 15-sack seasons, and throughout his career, he has had 3 of his seasons cut short. So J.J. Watt, whenever he's been on the field, he's basically guaranteed for 12-ish sacks to dominate opposing offensive linemen and quarterbacks, and he's always in the Defensive Player of the Year conversation, even this year before he was injured. The unfortunate part about Watt is he's kind of a lot like the defensive version of Rob Gronkowski. Maybe his career is cut short because of all of the injuries. But despite the injuries, he's been able to overcome them because he's such a hardworking individual and a dominant physical freak of nature that he still dominates grown men in the NFL like nobody's business. So J.J. Watt is the defensive player of the decade and my first defensive end, finishing 2nd in sacks, 1st in tackles for loss, and 1st in quarterback hits. Get this, by 45. The second defensive end on my all-decade team is surprising, I think. It's Chandler Jones. Chandler Jones I had to go back. I almost put Khalil Mack on my team. I was this close, but I do feel like Chandler Jones, he has both played longer in this decade, but also I feel like he has been very underrated, and I do feel like he's accomplished more in his numbers when you actually look at it physically. You could argue Khalil Mack's a better player, and I wouldn't hate on you for that, but I am leaning to Chandler Jones. Chandler Jones, of course, did win a Super Bowl in 2014 with the New England Patriots. He then went to his first Pro Bowl in 2015. He is likely to become a two-time All-Pro. He is a two-time sack leader unless he gives up his sack lead at the end of this season, which is unlikely because he's up by 3. He might even break the record. He's already, I think, at 19 and a half. Chandler Jones is 13th in quarterback hits and tackles for loss for this decade, and 3rd in sacks, only behind Von Miller and J.J. Watt. So when you belong in that conversation, you belong on this team, in my opinion. Jones, he led the league in sacks as many times as J.J. Watt. I got to give him the credit for that. And despite the dominance of players like Khalil Mack, Calais Campbell, and even Michael Bennett, who I feel like is extremely underrated for this decade, Chandler Jones gets the nod. At the linebacker position, this was by far the easiest position to pick in terms of multiple players, right? Because it's the 3 most dominant players at this position and arguably 3 of the top 5 defensive players of this entire decade. Let's start off with Von Miller. Von Miller is arguably the best pass rusher of this decade. He is a Super Bowl champion in 2015. He has been to 2 Super Bowls in 2013 and 2015. In one of them, he was a Super Bowl MVP. He had one of the greatest playoff performances in NFL history for any player, but a defensive player, he might be top 3 of all time. I mean, that 2015 run was just incredible versus the Steelers and Big Ben, Cam Newton in the Super Bowl, and Tom Brady and the Patriots in the AFC Championship. He dominated every game, and he made the 2015 defense one of the best of all time. He's a 7-time All-Pro, an 8-time Pro Bowler. He is a Defensive Rookie of the Year in 2011, 3rd in tackles for loss, 4th in quarterback hits, and oh yeah, the decade sack leader with 100 or more. The only player with 100 or more, 100 plus sacks. That's Von Miller. Not J.J. Watt, not Chandler Jones, not anybody but Von Miller. The only guy with over 100 sacks this decade. Luke Kuechly is the second linebacker on the all-decade team. Luke Kuechly has won a Defensive Player of the Year in 2013. He was a Defensive Rookie of the Year in 2012. A 7-time Pro Bowler, a 6-time All-Pro, maybe even going to add another All-Pro to that. Led the league in tackles 2 times. He had a Super Bowl appearance in 2015 with the 2015 Panthers. He is second most tackles in this decade. 18 interceptions, which is just an incredibly high number for a linebacker. Luke Kuechly, to me, is the best middle linebacker of this decade because he is the best well-rounded linebacker. He has incredible sideline-to-sideline speed. I think he's the most intelligent linebacker of this decade, being able to play a chess game with the opposing quarterback. He is insane in coverage. I mean, the 18 interceptions speak for themselves. He's a really, really good leader, and some of these defenses that the Panthers have had, they wouldn't have been nearly as good without Luke Kuechly in the middle because of all he did and the way he commanded his defense. And then Bobby Wagner is the last linebacker pick of this decade. Bobby Wagner, unlike Luke Kuechly, did win a Super Bowl in 2013 with the Legion of Boom, which he was a part of. 2014, he went back to the Super Bowl. Unfortunately, he did lose that game, but 2 Super Bowl appearances. Bobby Wagner is a 6-time Pro Bowler, a 5-time All-Pro, and he has the most tackles of this entire decade. If there's any player that comes even close to Luke Kuechly, it's Bobby Wagner. And for about the last 5-ish years, Bobby Wagner has been toe-to-toe with Luke Kuechly for the best linebacker in the game. He deserves a nod on the all-decade team. The ball hawks, the safeties behind those linebackers. Let's start off with, I believe, the obvious one, and that is Earl Thomas. If I've ever seen a safety replicate the style of play of Ed Reed, the closest one I've ever seen is Earl Thomas. Earl Thomas is a Super Bowl champion, going to 2 Super Bowls with the Legion of Boom Seahawks, which he was a massive part of. I would say maybe the most important part. That's debatable, but I would say probably he was, because when he was out of the lineup in those prime years, you saw the biggest impact. 7-time Pro Bowler, 5-time All-Pro, 30 interceptions, and over 10 forced fumbles. He is recorded the 3rd most interceptions in this decade. Earl Thomas, what I love about him is he's a modern safety. He is great in zone, but also can play a bit of man. He is very physical, but not cheap. And he's also rangy as all you know what. So Earl Thomas is the man at safety, and by far, in my opinion, the best safety of the decade. And my other safety, if I had a free safety and a strong safety, I would pick Earl Thomas as my free safety. And I contemplated his partner of the Legion of Boom, Cam Chancellor. Some other candidates like Devin McCourty and Eric Berry came to mind. But I did go with Eric Weddle, because I feel like Eric Weddle has been the most accomplished of this decade and maybe the most consistent. Now, Eric Weddle doesn't really pop up as one of the greatest safeties of all time. I think he's kind of underrated. I mean, 6-time Pro Bowler, 5-time All-Pro. He did lead the league in interceptions in 2011. He has the 7th most tackles of any player this decade. I believe that's second for a safety, and the 10th most interceptions. So Eric Weddle coupled a very physical in-box style, getting a lot of tackles, but also was very smart, savvy, and aware, and able to pick off passes. But physical as well, and very, very, very intelligent. So Eric Weddle is my other safety beside Earl Thomas. My starting corner is, of course, the number 1 corner on the team, Richard Sherman. Richard Sherman was kind of like the guy that was the glue of the Legion of Boom. I would say the overall leader of the Legion of Boom. Like I said, I think Earl Thomas was the most important player, but I think Richard Sherman brought the swagger of the Legion of Boom. The Super Bowl champion in 2013, of course, the infamous Michael Crabtree moment in the game before that. 2 Super Bowl appearances 2 years in a row with the Legion of Boom, 5-time Pro Bowler, 4-time All-Pro. He is an interception leader in 2013, 2 8+ interception seasons throughout the decade, and the most interceptions in this entire decade. Richard Sherman is maybe the best zone corner I've ever seen in my entire life, and maybe the best zone corner in NFL history. He is that good. I mean, he used to lock down an entire side of the field playing zone coverage, which not a lot of people can do. I mean, you've heard of like man-to-man guys, which Richard Sherman could do in his prime really well, but he was that zone guy that you never wanted to throw on his side because he could pick you off because he was so incredibly smart, and he also had incredible ball skills, very physical and tall, and just difficult for a lot of receivers. Richard Sherman is, in my opinion, the best corner of this decade. Now, the guy that is on the opposite side of him is a little bit of a different style of corner, and that is Patrick Peterson. Peterson is more of the man-to-man guy who would shut down a guy, as opposed to Richard Sherman, who is more of the playmaking type of corner. Now, Patrick Peterson is an 8-time Pro Bowler, a 3-time first-team All-Pro. He did have the most punt return touchdowns in one season of all time, which is tied, I believe, with Devin Hester. But nonetheless, a great punt returner and a great corner, and the 9th most interceptions of this decade. Patrick Peterson had great ball skills, but he wasn't really thrown at a lot in his prime, in his heyday. Very fast, as it speaks to his returning ability, and tall. I mean, he was what you made in a factory of a cornerback, and he was great since the day he was drafted. Patrick Peterson is the guy alongside Richard Sherman at corner, and because the slot corner position is such a big deal today in the NFL, I decided to go with one on my all-decade team. And that guy is Chris Harris Jr. of the Denver Broncos. Chris Harris, I think, is the most underrated corner of this decade. Very consistent. Won a Super Bowl with the Broncos in 2015 as a part of one of those great defenses we've seen of this decade. And I would say he was the second best player on that defense behind only Von Miller, really. I think Chris Harris was that good. And the thing about Chris Harris that I think gave him the edge over a lot of these other guys was the ability to play on the outside, but also the ability to play on the inside. A lot of corners can play on the outside, but not a lot of them can play both. And Chris Harris was able to do that and still is able to do that today. He's a 4-time Pro Bowler and a 3-time All-Pro. One game he'd cover Julian Edelman. The next game you would see him covering one of the premier outside guys like a Julio Jones. And that just speaks to the skills, the versatility of Chris Harris's game at the cornerback position. Now let's go to the special teams. The kicker, there were some easy ones on this list. Like I said, tight end was easy, quarterback was easy, linebacker was easy. Kicker, I didn't even have to think twice about this. It's Justin Tucker, and it's not even relatively close. Justin Tucker is the most accurate kicker of all time. He's a 2-time Pro Bowler, which is ridiculous. He should be like a 6-time Pro Bowler, maybe even more. A 4-time All-Pro, which I'm sure is going to be added to a 5th. A Super Bowl champion in 2012, and he had the 7th most decade points this decade in the 2010s. The only other kicker that I would say is even in the conversation is Stephen Gostkowski, and the only reason is because he had the most points and he also won 3 Super Bowls. But Justin Tucker, for his clutchness, his consistency, and his accuracy, and even his range to kick long field goals, I'm giving Justin Tucker the nod at the kicker position. And at punter, it's Johnny Hekker for me. Johnny Hekker is one of the greatest punters in NFL history. Johnny Hekker was called a weapon by Bill Belichick. Not many punters are called a weapon in the NFL, in the course of NFL history. Johnny Hekker is maybe the most underrated player of this entire decade. A 6-time All-Pro, a 4-time Pro Bowler, a 2-time punting leader, and the Super Bowl record for the longest punt ever in last year's Super Bowl. Johnny Hekker is one of the best punters of all time and the punter on the All-Decade team. The returner on the All-Decade team is Cordarrelle Patterson. Now, this actually might shock some people, but Cordarrelle Patterson is like one of the greatest returners of all time, and I don't think anybody really knows that or like recognizes that for some reason. 4-time All-Pro, 3-time Pro Bowler, a Super Bowl champion with the Patriots, the 4th most return yardage of this decade, and the most return touchdowns of this decade with 7, which is 3 more than anyone else this decade. I contemplated like Devin Hester, but I felt like for the span of the decade, it's Cordarrelle Patterson. Devin Hester was kind of in the middle of both of the last 2 decades. And the special teamer, again, another extremely easy decision for me because this guy might be the first core special teams player to go to the Hall of Fame, and that is Matthew Slater of the Patriots. Matthew Slater is a 3-time Super Bowl champion with 5 appearances, an 8-time Pro Bowler, and a 5-time special teams All-Pro player. That is not easy to say or do because special teams, a lot of injuries, a lot of physical play, and you have to be at peak physical condition to be a special teams player because you need to be fast and you need to be physical and you need to be tough. That's why it's a young man's sport on special teams. But Matt Slater's continuing to do it today as one of the best special teams players there is. I don't even know if I have to say this. Like Bill Belichick is the greatest coach of all time. And a big reason is because of what he did this decade. He added another 3 Super Bowls to his resume. He added another 5 Super Bowl appearances to his resume. A coach of the year in this decade, which, I mean, you could argue Bill Belichick's the best coach every single year in the NFL. He is the best coach, but the coach of the year, you could argue every single year because he does it with different rosters every single time and different strengths and different weaknesses on his football team. He has taken the Patriots to every single AFC Championship game since 2011. Nobody's ever done that before, and he has the most wins of this decade. I don't know how long Bill Belichick's going to coach, but to be the best coach of the 2000s and the 2010s by a far margin speaks for itself. That is the all-decade team of the 2010s. Thank you guys for watching, If you enjoyed, Gronk spike the like button, and again, comment below your all-decade team.